HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Red Mirror, Putin's Leadership and Russia's Insecure Identity by Gulnaz Sharafutdinova, read by Michael Page. Preface. Vladimir Putin is not the president of my choice. However, he is a president by virtue of the choices made by people I care about. My brother is proud of Putin. My father respects his foreign policy. My cousin voted for him, fearing instability and not seeing any viable alternatives. Educated as a political scientist, I understand the institutional mechanisms and policies in place for removing viable political alternatives and making Putin seem the only choice. Yet it is hard to deny that the degree of genuine support for Putin in Russian society goes beyond the fact that people find themselves choosing in the absence of alternatives. Soviet politics also lacked alternatives, but was far from producing pride about the communist leaders. Putin's appeal to many Russians has been real, and the analysts need to take this reality seriously and to explore its nature and sources, its meaning and implications. Needless to say, Putin's appeal varies across the time of his outsized presidential tenure. The puzzle this book is motivated by applies best to the window of time between 2014 and 2018, the moment that could be referred to as a prolonged post-Crimean syndrome or even high Putinism. This moment was ruptured to an extent by the effects of the unpopular pension reforms announced in the summer of 2018. Still, the significance of this moment and the meanings shared in Russian society in regard to Putin's leadership are likely to be more lasting. This book is motivated primarily by a personal urge to understand the gap between how many of my schoolmates, friends and family back home perceive Putin's leadership and how I perceive it. It is a gap in thinking about Russian politics that might not have existed if I had continued to live my life in the place I was born. It is a gap in perceptions that draws attention to the fact that our thinking is a product of the social environment. I have to take it seriously. I cannot treat these differences casually and do not believe, as some observers do, that they result from brainwashing and propaganda or originate in the cultural preferences for a strong hand or even moral bankruptcy and the inability of Russian people to distinguish right from wrong. The new Russia was born in the Soviet Union, a country with a great ambition to change human nature and create a new Soviet man. This new species, an idealized Soviet person, was supposed to love work and sacrifice her individual desires and motivations for the benefit of the collective, her motherland, and the future of communism and the coming generations. Brought up under a strong influence of my father, a product of Soviet social mobility of the 1960s, who moved from a poor rural background to a position of political and social dominance in one of the regions in the Republic of Tatarstan, I was as close to an ideal Soviet girl as one could probably get, and I absorbed the ideas of self-sacrifice and work for the common good early on. More than 2.5 decades after the fall of the Soviet Union, I find myself on the other side of the newly rising curtain. A Soviet girl who tended to ducklings growing up in the village turned into an American-educated political scientist. Meanwhile, some respected Russian sociologists proclaim that the Soviet man is back and that the personality features given rise by the Soviet system are being expressed in the younger generations. The Soviet era that produced a special Soviet personality mold is gone. How could it be reproduced in the present conditions? The analysis advanced in this book is not neutral. It is biased toward understanding the Russian predicament and empathizing with the Russian population, rather than pointing to where it went wrong. It is biased toward attributing the blame on the historical circumstances in which the agents acted, rather than on their inherent qualities. It is driven by the urge to share responsibility among individuals and actors in power positions rather than the Russian masses. I believe in the value of such an approach to research. A completely neutral political analysis is hardly possible to begin with. Since the very choice of the research question and even the specialization in a field or discipline are connected to the researcher's pre-existing proclivities, opinions, interests, and biases. Awareness and recognition of such biases is the first step needed in any research endeavor. We know that empathy and emotional intelligence are powerful tools in interpersonal understanding. Shouldn't we strive for an emotionally intelligent understanding of international relations and collective processes? Shouldn't empathy be seen as an essential epistemological tool and a unique route to knowledge linked to Verstehen? Scholars have approached this tool as experiential understanding that provides the observer with knowledge of another person's thoughts, feelings, and behavior. In individual psychology, empathy is an essential tool for empowering the individual in need of transforming her actions and reactions. The role of empathetic understanding in social and group psychology is as constructive and transformative as it is in individual psychology. American social psychologist Daniel Batson has long argued about the moral significance of empathy based on the understanding of the other's perspective. Dylan Maron, an American writer and performer, has argued that empathy is not an endorsement. Empathizing with someone you profoundly disagree with does not compromise your own deeply held beliefs and endorse theirs. It just means acknowledging the humanity of someone who was raised to think differently. We have entered a new post-globalization era, characterized by a global backlash against liberalism, multiculturalism, and globalization, and defined by more particularistic, group-driven politics of recognition. The current domestic politics and leaderships in Russia and the United States, Great Britain's decision to leave the European Union, and populist tendencies in Poland, Hungary, Italy, Austria, and other countries around the world all signify the arrival of new times. Francis Fukuyama, a Stanford-based professor and a perceptive observer of our times, has declared identity politics to be a master concept that explains much of what is going on in global affairs. This book is also about identity politics, national-level identity politics in Russia. Russia and the United States have often played each other's external other, using the images of one another to construct their own identities. For someone like myself, born and raised in the Soviet Union and Russia, and spending my adult years mostly in the United States, this perspective of the other is, in reality, the perspective that is also my own. My ultimate hope for this book is that it can serve as a contribution to enhancing the understanding of Russia, Russian society, and Russian citizens in the West. The logic of conflict might make it hard to reach out to the outer concentric circle of our identities and to perceive the ultimate commonality of all humans, whatever their nation and culture. For the West, it is all too easy to fit into the old shoes and reconstruct the old Cold War-era views about Russia, just as it has always been easy to promote anti-Americanism and anti-Westernism in the past 2 decades in Russia. It is too easy to succumb to the confrontational dynamics of intergroup relations in international politics, driven by simplified political and media representations of Russia and the United States. The collective drive, normally shared by and expressed through the group members, to view their own group or a nation as morally and culturally superior to the other is hard to resist. The social dimension of thinking and feeling is a boutique sphere of knowledge. Cognitive sciences and the study of various thinking processes such as perceiving, attending, classifying, signifying, timing, and remembering most often focus on either the individual or universal aspects of these psychological processes. It is the scholars who are interested in the understanding of social groups and cultures who have brought attention to the social aspects of cognition, developing entire subdisciplines such as cognitive sociology, social psychology, and cultural and cognitive anthropology that try to explain how and why thinking differs across societies and groups. In political science, cognition is a variable central to the subdiscipline of political psychology. However, most political psychologists, especially in the U.S. tradition, are predisposed toward looking at the individual-level mechanisms that are expected to be universal across cultures, when studying voting behavior, for example. Except for scholars who rely on social identity theory and those who study group-based phenomena such as nationalism or identity politics, the importance of the social aspect of human cognition appears to have been underappreciated. Within political science, constructivist scholars in the field of international relations have long argued about the importance of social cognitive structures for international political outcomes. It is a good time for comparativists also to recognize that thinking and believing are sometimes done in groups and are shaped by the historical and social context that varies across groups' boundaries. Engaging with these issues in the Russian domestic context, I believe, is promising, both analytically and politically. You cannot step twice into the same river, a classic saying. Or can you? Do our senses force us to see the familiar, the known, the expected, and dismiss the unfamiliar, the strange, the unknown? How can we use the insights in social psychology to arrive at a less biased understanding and give credit and the blame where they are due? Russian society is a diverse mix. One can always find in there what she or he is looking for. Along with the revival of the Soviet person, you can find a civic person organizing to fight the fires and the floods, defending parks and forests, opening new stores and businesses, fundraising for worthy causes. You can find a religious person attending a church or a mosque, praying and fasting, walking in sacred processions and traveling to Mecca for the Hajj. You can find an ethnic entrepreneur, a man or a woman, who uses the market forces to revive ethnic customs and rituals, folklore clothes, dance and holidays. You can find bandits and criminals, crooks and charlatans. But you can also find heroes and visionaries, those who dedicate their lives to public causes, pursue an idea, fight injustice, and help others. You can find activists who want to revive Stalin's cult in Russia, but you can also find those who invest their lives and limited resources into discovering and commemorating the victims of political and social repressions that took place during the Soviet era. Recognizing this diversity is important. Making any of these groups and categories of people a focus of research is likely to result in a different vision of Russia, to point to different challenges that the country faces, to highlight different social and political trends, achievements and failures, and to have different implications for understanding the country's past, present and future. Her focus on the Soviet legacy and Russia's present-day collective national identity comes at the cost of ignoring and smoothing out other markers of social difference in present-day Russia that are as real and consequential as the issues attended to in this book. However, what is gained in return is valuable, for me personally and hopefully for the listener, for making sense of some of the psychological conundrums that have emerged in the social and political realities of Russia of the 2010s. Part 1. Of Leaders and Followers. People like simple explanations. When it comes to Russia and its predicament, some observers see Russia under Putin as returning to its Soviet past. Others refer to resurgent nationalism and even fascism. When trying to explain these unwanted developments, some observers blame Putin or collective Putin. Others blame Homo Sovieticus and draw attention to cultural and psychological imprint of the past. In Part 1, I engage with these views and explanations and provide my own, based on social identity theory and on understanding the Russian nation and Russian society as a group, as a community that wants to value itself, and the role played by Putin's leadership in making this happen, if temporarily. 1. The return of the Soviet through the national in post-Soviet Russia. No quality of human nature is more remarkable, both in itself and in its consequences, than that propensity we have to sympathize with others, and to receive by communication their inclinations and sentiments, however different from or even contrary to our own. David Hume, A Treatise of Human Nature, 2007, page 206. Many of the things happening now are the remains of the Soviet past. The Soviet past was not buried in the 1990s, and it is now resuscitated in a mutated and a half-rotten way. We have to live now with this monster reawakened by those who knew its physiology, neural centers, and who inserted needles in specific spots. A form of a domestic voodoo. I am afraid this experiment will have catastrophic consequences. Vladimir Sorokin, 2015. On December 10, 2011, as the big crowds of angry urbanites gathered on the streets of Moscow, The Economist ran a puzzling headline on the long life of Homo Sovieticus. While many Muscovites demanded honest elections marking a new era of greater political engagement in the Russian society, some Russian sociologists associated with the Levada Center, a respected polling agency, proclaimed the return of the Soviet man. Deservedly, the angry urbanites in Moscow received more media attention at the time than the purportedly regenerated Soviet man. After all, they were more vocal, visible, politically active, and centrally located. Enthused by these developments, I, for one, wrote about the hope for Russian progressivism, recounting the lessons of the American progressive era. Alas, the political and social developments in Russia after these promising events of 2011 to 2012 turned backward very rapidly. The promise of progressivism was replaced by the consolidation of conservatism and the assertion of traditional values promoted as the new moral foundation of the Kremlin-led politics. The country underwent a wave of national consolidation in support of the 2014 Crimea annexation. The subsequent international sanctions against Russia and the continuing crisis in eastern Ukraine created a new status quo characterized by polarization and a tense standoff between Russia and the West. Russia of 2011 and Russia of post-2014 seem like two different countries, belonging to different historical eras and separated not merely by a few years, but by decades, if not centuries. This abrupt turnaround in the political and social landscape in Russia warrants a closer look at the category of the Soviet man suggested by the Russian sociologists. Understanding the nature and meaning of the alleged return of the Soviet person a quarter century after the Soviet system itself collapsed might provide a clue to understanding present-day Russian politics. Many other signs point to the increasing trend of the return of the Soviet in Russia. Over the last years, the Levada Center has been observing a growing sympathy toward Joseph Stalin. Thus, the number of respondents who expressed sympathy toward Stalin as one of the revolutionary leaders has tripled from 8% in 1990 to 24% in 2017. Furthermore, the number of respondents who expressed their respect, sympathy, and admiration of Stalin as one of the historical figures reached a record 51% in April 2019, spurring heated debates on social media and online blogs about the symbolic meaning of Stalin in the Russian society, as well as the interpretation of polling results. Among the Soviet-era leaders, only Leonid Brezhnev, associated with the stability and relative domestic calm of the late Soviet Union, received a similarly high level of support among Russian citizens. In 2017, 47% of respondents expressed positive views about Brezhnev. The same poll placed support for Russia's current president, Vladimir Putin, at 83%. Many Russians mourn the collapse of the Soviet Union. According to Levada polls, 66% of respondents in December 2018 confessed to regretting the Soviet collapse, and 60% believed that it could have been saved. In 2000, the number of those who were uneasy about the Soviet collapse was even larger, reaching 75% of all respondents and viewed by sociologists as the peak of Soviet nostalgia. But in the past few years, the numbers were growing again, setting a new trend. For Westerners who had witnessed the Cold War rivalry and were conditioned by anti-communist propaganda, and even for those who were born later and might have studied communism from history books, such Soviet nostalgia, and even more menacingly, the rising support for Joseph Stalin, a historical figure frequently placed side by side with Adolf Hitler, are understandably very alarming and perplexing. Stalinism, with its mass murder of the Soviet people, is not a system to be nostalgic about. But only a selective few in Russia think about mass murder when they talk about Stalin today. Many Russian people credit him with Soviet economic expansion and industrialization, contrasting these achievements to Russia's current economic decline and overdependence on energy and other natural resources. They associate Stalin with the holy victory in the Great Patriotic War, as well as with the patriotism and national consolidation that accompanied the war efforts. They see in Stalin a leader who built a country that was strong, powerful, and admired by others. Meanwhile, the murderous aspects of Stalinism are downplayed or even explained away with reference to the brutalities of the times. These other parts of history are often disregarded and forgotten, as if they are an aberration unrelated to what the regime stood for. The mythologization of Stalin's figure in Russia has not been occurring by chance. This process appears to be preordained by the evolutionary logic of Russia's political system under Vladimir Putin. The image of the leader who built the Soviet Union and led it to the holy victory more than half a century ago today resonates with the image of Vladimir Putin, who is credited with saving Russia from the chaos and fragmentation of the 1990s. The two myths that recognize the outstanding role of these strong leaders in Russia's national history prop each other up and perpetuate popular convictions that in some historical situations it is necessary to concentrate all power in one man's hands. The changing attitudes towards Stalin in Russia and the shift of dispositions from a vigilant never again to the patriotic we can repeat it again, my możemy powtórzyć, have baffled observers within and outside of Russia. Some pundits wrote about the moral impotence of the Russians, viewed as being unable to face the collective guilt for the crimes of the Soviet regime. David Satter, an American journalist and Russia observer, complained that the Russians are too passive and unable to pass moral judgments. They do not value individual life and prefer nationalist delusions. Even earlier, Dina Khapayeva, a Russian-educated literary and cultural studies scholar, argued that post-Soviet society is seriously ill with a partial amnesia that makes historical memory strangely selective. She developed a conception of Gothic morality, propagating the striking equality of good and evil, a cult of force, and a preoccupation with personal interests to capture the societal consequences of this collective amnesia. Other commentators took a more sanguine posture and noted that the very recognition of who the victims are under Stalinism is a challenging and arbitrary process. The existence of the large grey zone formed by the blurred lines between the victims and perpetrators under Stalinism made it hard to apply the concepts and ethics from the transitional justice paradigm used, for example, in the German case of overcoming the past. Arseny Roginsky, a historian and one of the founders of Memorial Human Rights and Historical Preservation Society, argued, "In the memory of the terror, we are unable to assign the main roles, unable to put in their rightful place the pronouns we and they. This impossibility of disassociation from evil is effectively the main obstacle for the development of fully fledged social memory of the terror." Antony Kalashnikov, a historian who inquired into different normative perspectives that opposing narratives on Stalinism build on, also called for more analytical nuance and attention to the Russian context in the study of the collective memory of Stalinism in Russia. The moral repentance and atonement for the mass crimes in Soviet society did start in the Soviet Union during the Glasnost period. Leon Aron wrote about the profound shift in values that drove the Russian Revolution of 1987 to 1991. He brought attention to the troubadours of truth, the journalists, writers, and activists who were in the avant-garde of the ongoing moral restoration. Aron's book came out at a promising moment of widespread protests in Russia, when thousands of people took to the streets with the demands for dignity, honest elections, and accountable government. It was a moment that allowed Aron to link the value shift of the late 1980s to the demands of protesters in 2011 to 2012. But the moment was a fleeting one. The political and social developments in post-2012, and particularly post-Crimea annexation Russia, brought into relief the fact that the discussed moral restoration of the late 1980s that was supposed to bring Russian society face-to-face with its past to avoid its repetition in the future did not last. The consolidation that Russian society underwent in the aftermath of the Crimea annexation in 2014, the rising popularity of Stalin and Brezhnev, the Kremlin's success in propagating anti-Americanism and anti-Westernism, all point to the unfinished character of the attempt at collective repentance and learning history's lessons associated with the perestroika years. Judging from what is being discussed on Russia's main TV channels, the opposite trend, a belligerent defensiveness and resentful nationalism, seem to dominate collective feelings in Russia today. How and why did Russian society reach this point? Have the decades of post-communist transformation in Russia all gone to waste, if such uncritical appreciation of the Soviet system has made a comeback? What does the Soviet past have to do with the current Russian condition? It is hard to deny that Russia's historical trajectory under Vladimir Putin increasingly bears Soviet markers. Slowly but surely, we witness the return of practices and institutions, symbols and rhetoric invented and used by the Soviet regime. It started with the rewritten Soviet anthem in 2000 and was reflected, among other things, in a slow transformation of the United Russia, the current party of power in Russia, into an institution that increasingly resembles, in its style and practices, the Soviet-era Communist Party of the Soviet Union. "Do they smoke something Soviet?" asked jokingly Danila Galperovich, a journalist from the Voice of America, in the aftermath of the 18th Congress of the United Russia held on December 7 to 8, 2018. The revival of Soviet-like party congresses and party schools, of humanitarian aid to Syria and Donbass, Ukraine, of Soviet-era rhetoric about foreign agents, of foreign wars fought by the military but not officially recognized by the state, of patriotic organizations for engaging and educating youth in the spirit of defending their motherland, of censorship and self-censorship in the media, of increasing repression and other Soviet-era governance practices, institutions and attitudes, all signify Putin's Russia. These reinvented remains of the past coexist with the new communication technologies in the atmosphere shaped by Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and its more important Russian equivalent, VKontakte. This list has been expanding in the past few years. Russian interference in electoral processes in foreign countries is also not a new phenomenon, but a revival of the menu of active measures associated with Soviet intelligence services, such as the main Intelligence Directorate, GRU, activities during the Cold War. These developments are hardly accidental, but it would be a mistake to treat them as if they had been predetermined by Russia's history, culture, or type of human material better known today under the label of the Soviet man. Such arguments, which have become quite popular, even among the Russian intelligentsia, convey hopelessness and resignation, and at times simple Russophobia. Many Russian intellectuals who knew better than to join the new patriotic consensus forged in the aftermath of the Crimea annexation found themselves marginalized by the Kremlin's new identity politics. Many critically oriented journalists, writers, editors, business people and others have left Russia or are looking for an exit, preferring to live in Kiev, Prague, London, Riga, and other foreign countries and cities. Their deep sense of disappointment and hopelessness, reflected in their choice to leave the country, their feelings of loss, and the challenges of creating new lives and new careers in a new environment, are all understandable. Some analysts...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?